Hello again, and welcome to Pick Yourself, the podcast that helps you build a meaningful electronic music career. If your goal is to create and release outstanding music on respected labels, get better bookings, and grow a tribe of true fans instead of just social followers, then this show is for you. My name is Philip, thanks for tuning in, and now let's get right into today's episode. This is episode number 40 of Pick Yourself. Welcome to the show. It's time to celebrate, and for that occasion I have brought a very special episode topic today. We are going to talk about mixing. I will help you get better at mixing because a lot of you have been requesting this topic for quite a long time already. So that means I've listened to you and I'm bringing you the good stuff now. And before we jump into today's topic, let me quickly say thank you. Yeah, thanks to all of you who've listened to all 40 episodes, but also thank you to the ones who've just tuned in for the first time. It means a lot. I would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to the show, and also if you enjoy it, please leave a little review on your podcast app. That will help me a lot. It will motivate me, put out more content for you for free. So yeah, I still remember when I started the podcast, I had no idea if this was going to work, if this was something of value to people. But yeah, I'm overwhelmed by all the emails I get from you, by all the comments. I love the people that are inside the group. So you can go to pickyourselfpodcast.com/community. We have a private Facebook group. It's all for free, where you can have exchange going with other music producers that are more or less at your level, but also some really experienced people. And yeah, I would absolutely enjoy to have more of you inside that group, not because I'm a huge fan of Facebook groups, but I think this is really a good way to get some exchange going. And I also want to say thank you to the people who have downloaded the 7 strategies of highly successful electronic music artists. So that is my free PDF that goes as the kind of background resource with this podcast. You can get it at pickyourselfpodcast.com/free if you haven't already. And I want to say thank you to the people who have downloaded this, who have read this, and then also, this is the most important part, who have implemented this. And they're already seeing quite a lot of success thanks to that, even just a couple of months after they've downloaded this resource. I'm super happy to see, the results that people get out of this. So thank you for letting me know. If you have implemented this and you want to let me know if this has worked for you, please drop me an email, philip@copilco-productions.com, or just post it into our group, that's also fine. I'm super curious to hear from you, to hear your results, and to see how your artist career is growing thanks to that resource. All right, let's now jump straight into our episode of today, how to get better at mixing. And I'm going to give you 5 easy steps that you can implement right after this episode, basically. So if you are an electronic music producer and you want to get better at mixing, then I think I've created an episode that is really valuable to you. I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of little tricks and tips that I could give you, but I have selected 5 things that I believe really make a difference for improving your skills as a mixer. And by the way, with mixing, I don't mean like the DJ mixing of 2 songs. I mean mixing in music production, like making stuff sound better. So first of all, I want you to not be scared of mixing. I think that creating better mixes is not as hard as you think. The only thing that you need is patience. It just takes some time to get better. It takes practice, dedication, and a strong will to learn. If you have these things in place, then that's enough. That's good enough. You have everything you need. There's not a huge talent involved, not like magic, golden ears or something. This is not the most important part. It's mostly practice, dedication, the joy of mixing, like you should enjoy doing that, and you should be eager to learn. Now, contrary to many articles out there, here is what you don't need to get better at mixing. First of all, you don't need expensive equipment. No, you don't need any fancy analog gear or the latest and greatest plugin, because actually the stock tools that come with your DAW are already highly sophisticated. And I mean, it doesn't hurt to have a few external plugins. I also use a lot of external plugins, but I want to tell you that gear matters less than you might think. So this is not the thing that gets in the way of you creating better mixes. The second thing you don't need is an acoustically treated studio room. And I mean, I won't lie here, I love my room, and I think it helps a lot to have a well-treated space with great speakers. But if you're just not in the lucky position of having a dedicated studio room, this won't prevent you from mixing great songs. And if a pro mixing engineer like Andrew Scheps, for example, who mixed some of the biggest hits in the world, like he has several Grammy Awards and so on, if a guy like that can mix major label productions on headphones on an airplane, then why can't you? Yeah, of course, he's way more experienced, but still, I mean, the possibility is there. And I don't want you to use your lack of a great room or lack of great speakers be an excuse. You still can create great mixes, and I've heard fantastic mixes by people who just mixed on headphones. That's fine. And then another thing you don't need is a degree in sound engineering. Because mixing is more a creative task than a technical one, and the most boring mixes I've heard come from people who focus too much on technical perfection. And yes, you should have at least some basic knowledge about things like sample rate, bit depth, and so on, and why you shouldn't go about 0 dBFS on your master bus. But yeah, the great thing is that most of this knowledge is available for free, or at least considerably cheap. When I say you don't need to study music production or sound engineering, that does not mean that you shouldn't do this. Yeah, so I think it's fine to study something like this. I think it's fine to get more involved, but it's not a necessity for you to be able to create great mixes. And now, some of you might be asking, why should I even improve my mixing skills? I mean, I can also hire a mixing engineer. And to be honest with you, since this is where I make most of my living with, like mixing and mastering people's tunes, of course I'm thankful if you hire me, but this episode is actually still helping you get better mixes, because I believe this is important no matter if you outsource that work or if you plan on doing it by yourself. Even if you don't plan to mix your own songs for the final release, you should still try to improve your skills, because this will help you figure out what separates good mixes from bad ones, and which mixing engineer to hire if you plan to hire one. And moreover, I also think that it can be a blessing when it comes to stuff like mix revisions. Yeah, so the correction rounds from the first version of the mix to the next one and so on. If you speak the same language as the engineer, then you will get much more out of the process overall. And if you plan to do your own mixes, then of course, you have to improve your skills. There's no way around that. And apart from that, I think that improving your mixing skills also helps you make better decisions even earlier in the process. Now, what do I mean with that? One thing that you'll encounter is that a great mix relies heavily on fantastic sound design in the stage before. And that means that your choices of samples, your choices of how you design your lead synth, your bass line, and so on, all these things are going to improve as well when you learn more about mixing. Okay, now let's discuss how you can actually get better at mixing your songs. And I'm going to share with you the exact formula that has helped my coaching clients. And of course, with my coaching clients, I have an ongoing feedback loop going. I'm helping them constantly improve on their mixes. I give very specific and detailed feedback on things, and we discuss certain techniques in detail. But overall, like the first thing that we discuss in the first sessions is usually the formula that I'm going to give you here now. So this formula consists of 5 steps. The first one is improve your critical listening skills and use reference songs. Now, training your ears is, in my opinion, the most important part of the process. And you can, of course, use some ear training apps, like, for example, QuizTones. This is a really popular one, to get a better understanding of sound frequencies. But there's another method that I have found to be even more effective, and that is you listen to reference songs by your favorite artists in your DAW, and you look at the frequencies with a free spectrum analyzer plugin. That one is called Span by Voxengo. So Span by Voxengo is a really, really cool spectrum analyzer plugin, and you can throw just a song into your session. You can then throw this plugin on the channel, and then listen to the song and look at the frequency spectrum chart there and see what happens. And what's really special about this tool is that you can zoom in and solo certain frequencies. Yeah, you just control click, or on Mac you command click on a certain frequency in the spectrum. And this way it's super easy to, for example, locate the punch of a kick drum, or the center frequency of a hi-hat, or where exactly the edgy parts of the lead synth are located. And all these things help you get better at understanding how frequencies work together. You suddenly find out, okay, so the edginess of that lead synth, that somehow is the same frequency that the vocal sample that I use has. Or maybe the claps that you also use. You have like a very full production with claps, hats, and then a vocal sample and a lead synth. And suddenly you notice if you listen to a certain frequency band in there and you solo in with span, you suddenly figure out, okay, all these frequencies are clashing in that area. That helps you learn like how to prioritize. And if you analyze tracks on a daily basis, your critical listening skills as well as your understanding of frequencies will increase dramatically, I promise. Yeah, so this is just practice. It's not talent. It's not like having magic ears. It's just practice. So another aspect of critical listening is to connect sonic information with emotions. Yeah, so we've talked a lot about the technical aspects of listening, but there's also the creative aspect of listening. So start asking yourself questions like this. What about the song is making me feel energized or melancholic or dreamy and so on? Why is this lead synth giving me goosebumps on a large sound system? Or how is the arrangement of the song influencing my feeling of tension? Or something like this. Why do kick drum and bass line feel like they're dancing with each other? So you try to find very vivid images of how instruments work together, how the whole song comes to life, how the arrangement comes into place. And this helps you listen more creatively and analyze the sound in a non-technical way. So overall, if you want to get better at mixing, then this aspect of improving your critical listening skills is the most important one. This is the first step you need to take. So make sure you focus on the technical as well as the emotional aspects of sound. Now let's move to step number 2. Learn to use a handful of tools really, really well. So upcoming music producers get swamped with heavily discounted plugins and endless promo campaigns and yet another game changer plugin that is supposed to revolutionize your mixes or your workflow. And guess what? In the end, none of that really matters. Tools can be super helpful, of course, but only if you know how to use them well. And that's exactly my point here. If your goal is to get better at mixing your songs, you should focus on using a very limited set of tools. So learning a handful of plugins really, really well always beats having hundreds of tools in your arsenal but only knowing them superficially. And why is that even that important to have a deep understanding of a selected range of tools? Well, some plugins are super intuitive to use, and with others it's the exact opposite. And now let me give you an example here. You might think that, well, an EQ is an EQ. There's nothing special about that. If you know one EQ, then you know all of the EQs. You just can buy different flavors and so on. Well, it's not that easy. The best example here is a Pultec style equalizer. So Pultec is a very famous vintage brand, basically, and there are many new forms of emulations that try to mimic that sound of the analog hardware. I think the original hardware is from the 60s or something. And many plug-in brands claim to have nailed this original sound and so on. And just to give you some options here, Universal Audio, they have the Pultec Passive EQ collection. Then Softtube has the TubeTech bundle. This is, by the way, the one that I use for this plugin at the moment. Waves has released the Puig Tech, which models the exact unit that Jack Joseph Puig, one of the most famous mixing engineers, has in his studio. And there are many more options. But what's interesting here is that most upcoming producers who buy one of these equalizers don't have a clue how they actually work. Maybe they get them because you're, supposed to have one of these in your plugin collection. That's at least what their buddies tell them. And the problem with this is that you have to understand how these knobs are connected. You have to understand how the different EQ bands in this passive equalizer influence each other. And by the way, there is strange stuff happening. So you can, for example, boost and cut the same frequency on this EQ, but that doesn't result in a null. Yeah, so it doesn't cancel out. It actually creates a different curve. And you can use this different curve to your advantage. And I've seen so many people use Pultec style equalizers the wrong way simply because they haven't read the manual and they haven't practiced using this EQ. And this is just one of many examples. Then compare this with somebody who has worked with this type of EQ for years. A person that has studied how these frequency bands interact with each other, a person that knows intuitively how to use it. It's a completely different way of using the tool. And that brings me to the next aspect of this here. Mixing is all about entering flow state. This intuitive state of just getting in there and doing what's necessary to make that song shine in whatever way possible. So this way of entering flow state is only possible if you don't have to look up the manual, if you don't have to second guess your decisions, if you really, really know your tools well and you can be super fast. And this is also, if you've ever wondered why professional mixing engineers are extremely fast and get the work done in a couple of hours instead of several days, this is because they're mixing intuitively. You can only get into this flow state if you're using the same set of tools day in and day out. And this is why focusing on just a few plugins, but knowing them really, really well, is so important. And yes, from time to time, it's also important to shake things up a bit, to try out new things so you don't get lazy. Yeah, but you can do this after being extremely confident with your limited set of tools. Now, step number 3 is focus on the 20% that make up 80% of the emotional impact. So a very common problem of music producers who want to learn how to mix better is that they focus on the wrong things. So for example, they tend to work on small details of a shaker sound or of a hi-hat, while completely ignoring that the overall balance in their percussion group is completely off. They spend hours tweaking a compressor on a kick drum, but they don't really notice that the sample is simply in the wrong key and it clashes with the bass for that reason. And these are the things that people don't notice, so they focus on the wrong things. And when trying to get better at mixing your tracks, you can revisit the so-called 80-20 rule. So this is also known as the Pareto principle. And what that principle basically says is that 80% of the effects usually come from 20% of the causes. Let me repeat that. 80% of the effects usually come from 20% of the causes. And while the exact number might vary from case to case, you're still going to find patterns like this in many examples. And I won't go deep into other examples, I will just keep it straight, focused on mixing. So let's talk about the Pareto principle in mixing. If you focus on the 20% that make up 80% of the emotional impact of your mix, you're on the right track to success. And my recommendation is to focus on the following emotional characteristics in a mix. Are the lead elements speaking to you as if someone was telling you a story face to face? That's quite interesting. Are the lead elements speaking to you as if someone was telling you a story face to face? And what that means technically is, are the volume levels right? And are the correct frequencies of the most important elements emphasized? Yeah, this is the technical side of that coin. But I want you to look at the emotional one. This is the more important one. Next one is, does the rhythm section make you move in your chair? Technically that means, are the microdynamics and the macrodynamics supporting the groove of the song? Next thing is, do you feel like the song is pulling you in and surrounding you? And what that technically means is, have you created a 3-dimensional soundstage from left to right, from front to back, from top to bottom? Yeah. So I want you to listen from a creative perspective and not from a technical one. And ask yourself these questions. You can go to pickyourselfpodcast.com and look up the show notes of this episode. There I have laid out everything in detail again, so you can come back to that. You don't have to re-listen to the episode. And if you focus on these bigger picture questions, you're much more likely to get better at mixing compared to someone who just works on a single hi-hat for hours. And now that's a perfect segue to point number 4 on my list here. Mix creatively, not technically. So this goes hand in hand with the point before. The more you focus on the creative aspects of mixing instead of the technical ones, the more likely you are to create an awesome mix. So you shouldn't completely neglect the technical aspects, of course, but they have to move back a bit when it comes to the actual mixing sessions. And the question is now, how do you do this? How do you remove the technical aspects and make the creative ones top of mind? Well, it's quite easy. You separate the mix preparation from the actual mixing session. You have to separate that time-wise. So this is the easiest way of removing the technical problems and difficulties. I tend to prepare projects for mixing the evening before I start the mixing session, because this way I can make sure all the technical details are checked before I start mixing. So I don't have to worry about that anymore. And yeah, the mix preparation is done. And if you have no clue what mix preparation means, like, I'm going to give you a few examples. So for example, importing files and checking for technical errors. Yeah, so if you mix your own stuff, of course, you should not mix inside the session where you have all your MIDI plugins, your MIDI instruments still active. You should export that as different audio files and import them in your mixing template. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So importing files and checking for technical errors. This is the first thing here. Making sure that bit depth and sample rate are correct. Yeah, so you don't want to switch sample rates all the time. You want to make sure that you work at a high bit depth. So at least 24-bit, better is 32-bit floating point. The labeling and coloring of tracks. Yeah, so everything is automatic. You know exactly what color, what instrument is, and what it's called. And distributing them in your session template according to your preferences. And if all of that is done, then that means on the next day I can start the actual mixing sessions without having to worry about routing, naming, coloring, and whatnot. So this allows me to focus on the creative aspects of mixing. Now, what does creative mixing mean? Creative mixing simply means that you focus on enhancing the emotional impact of the song. Yeah. With music, you're always telling a story, and mixing is a little bit like the design of a book that contains that story. So, just to stay in that analogy, using the right typography, picking the right paper, so the perfect paper that has this nice feel, and choosing great illustrations. So that all makes a big difference for how the end product feels. And of course, the story itself is the most important thing, and a shiny cover won't save a bad book from rotting on the shelves of the bookstore or Amazon warehouse or whatever it is. So it's the same with mixing. If the production itself is bad and the song is just bad, then no mix will save that, of course. So creative mixing just means you focus on enhancing that story. You help that story come to life with whatever tools you have available and whatever techniques you know. Your job is to make that story come through. Now, the last point on my list of how to get better at mixing is create a clever mix template. And now, I'm a big fan of templates, and actually that's the case with most professional engineers. We all love to work with templates because they help us mix creatively. As discussed in the point before, you want to remove any friction, you want to remove all the headache, all the technical stuff, you want to just be in the zone, in your flow state and start the mix. And a template, for those of you who don't know, is just a session file in your preferred DAW that you can use over and over again as a starting point every time you want to mix a song. And just to make that clear, having a template does not mean that you have like default presets on every single channel and you just throw in the audio files and there you have your mix. Yeah, that's not the way it works. But actually a template is just a clever way of structuring your session in the best case scenario. So if you want to get better at mixing, I highly recommend you come up with a mixing template that helps you find your own workflow. So here are some things that you should have in place there. Create empty tracks that are named and colored in a way that makes sense to you. For example, in my case, I always have red for kick drums, yellow for percussions, purple for bass, and so on. So you have colors, you have a naming scheme. Then you group these tracks in ways that suit your workflow. For example, having a percussions group with all the shakers and hi-hats and so on, that might be a good idea. Just as an example, you have to find out for yourself which types of groups you want and which ones you don't want. So some people, for example, always group the kick and the bass together in one group. I personally don't do this. I want to have my kick immediately available until the very last stage of the mix, so I don't want to group that together with the bass. But I understand why some people are doing this. So you have to figure out for yourself what you want to do. And you can try out and experiment. Then the next thing you need to do in your template is you create aux channels, so send and return channels. And you have some reverb and delay effects already set up, so you can easily send tracks to these channels and get a result. So you immediately get a feel, okay, how does that feel if it gets a little bit deeper and so on. And then you can obviously adjust the parameters still on that channel, on that effect. And then you also want to have something like a safety limiter on your master bus that protects your outputs from digital clipping. And so these things are the minimum you should have in place in your template. And of course, you can also go way deeper with this. Some people, for example, like to include their favorite plugins with some go-to settings on some channels of their mix template. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to be a bit more experienced to know when these settings are causing problems and when they're okay. And I don't recommend doing this when you're just starting out. And so, just to give you an example here, some YouTube tutorials and also some blogs recommend putting high and low cut filters on all of your channels in your session. Now, this is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of learning that practical stuff only from free tutorials, because a lot of YouTubers out there are mainly YouTubers. They're not mixing engineers, they're not producers, they're YouTubers most of the time. And using filters on all channels can make your mixes sound flat and boring. So if you have a filter, a high cut, a low cut filter on all of your channels, that is the thing that can make your mixes sound super flat and boring. I sometimes get tracks to master that sound like there was a curtain in front of my speakers. And so I'm sitting there in my studio, I'm listening to the track and I'm wondering, why is there no low end? Why is there this last octave missing? And why is there no high end in the whole track? Somehow strange, what happened there? And then I'm calling the people that I'm working with and they usually tell me, yeah, I've just watched that YouTube tutorial that told me that I should use high cut and low cut filters on all my channels. Yeah, of course, this is why it sounds super boring and flat. Yeah, that is because the producers have followed this bad advice. Yeah. So these are the things where you have to be a bit more experienced to know, like, does it make sense to have something on your channel already as a default? Okay, so let's quickly recap my 5 steps to get better at mixing. The first one is improve your critical listening skills and use reference songs. The next one is learn to use a handful of tools really well. Then focus on the 20% that make up 80% of the emotional impact. Next one is mix creatively, not technically. And the last one is create a clever mix template. And now let's talk about how you can put this into action. So how can you now implement the things you've learned in this episode? Here are my 3 action steps. The first one is listen critically to the last 3 songs you've mixed. So ask yourself, have you managed to focus on the 20% that are most important? And also, what could be optimized from a creative mixing perspective? So that is a good way to start your critical listening skills. And then also move on to daily practicing these critical listening tasks, using Voxengo Span, looking at what is actually happening in your reference tracks, listening carefully, looking at the spectrum analyzer, pulling out and soloing certain frequencies. That is a really, really good practice. Then, action step number 2, commit to using only a selected set of tools. So you choose a handful of tools you'll be using in your next mixes, and you try to learn them as deeply as possible. And don't buy any new plugins for the next 6 months, or maybe even longer. 12 months would be even better, but at least 6 months. And then, last but not least, action step number 3, create or update your mix template. So it doesn't have to be perfect, just start with a first version and then adjust it to your needs over time. This is automatically getting better. I adjust my mix template every year, sometimes even every half year. Stick to a certain color and naming scheme because this helps you make the right moves and mix intuitively. Okay, that's it for this week's episode. Now I would love to hear from you what has helped you get better at mixing and what are you still struggling with. I would love to hear from you. You can leave a comment on the blog post, pickyourselfpodcast.com. I read everything, I reply to everything. You can also go to pickyourselfpodcast.com/community and start or join the discussion there in our Facebook community. I would love to see you there. And last but not least, if you want to grow your electronic music career, then I highly recommend going to pickyourselfpodcast.com/free and download the 7 strategies of highly successful electronic music artists. This is a no bullshit free PDF guide that takes you like 5 minutes to read, but it can dramatically change the outcome of your next moves, of your artist career overall. I really believe in this free resource. A lot of people have already benefited from it. So go to pickyourselfpodcast.com/free and be the next person that grows their artist career and let me know how it goes. That's it for episode number 40. Thanks for tuning in and see you next week. If you don't want to miss any of the upcoming episodes, please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And you can find detailed blog posts for every single episode on pickyourselfpodcast.com. Until then, see you next time.